All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about backend APIs or server-side APIs. Let's go ahead and dive straight into our lecture. So why third-party APIs? It's important to continue to utilize the dry and SRP. So dry syrup, that's what I like to always think about. Dry meaning don't repeat yourself, and then syrup, the single responsibility principle. And in this case, we now want to add the work smarter, not harder principle. If there's an API that is running and holds the functionality we need, we can ping it with the proper information through our own API. All right. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. People will try to interact with an API that's server side with their front end, and then kind of not understand why is it that we need to, or how the communication happens with that application. So here we have our client that sends a request to our own Django API, right? Our own Django API doesn't touch our database in this case because it's going to use an external API. Instead, our Django server sends different API request to a third-party API, kind of like a connecting file to another server. That other server talks to its own database, runs its own logic, and returns a response to our server that we then format and return a response to our client. Again, at this point, what we're doing is we're just connecting the dots between a third-party server, our server, and the client. All right, so why third-party APIs? Here we can see an example again of the server where for us, as the request comes in, we might receive something like, hey, this is the image that I want you to generate, right? And it's going to be sent to our Django server. This path should look pretty familiar as far as what we've seen in Django syntax. Now, when we communicate to a third-party server, what we're going to utilize is going to be a library called requests. And requests is almost the same thing as Axios. It allows me to send different types of requests to third-party APIs or to other APIs and process the response, receive all that information, and we'll highlight the key differences between how Python and JavaScript handle requests in this case. Now we can see there that the request gets sent to anapi.com and they have their own version, their own images, and their own variable that they accept. Well, in our function, we just send that through, wait for that response, and then we process that on our server. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? Perfect. Let's go ahead and dive straight in. So again, we're going to be talking about why third-party APIs, getting to know your API, starting an API app, interacting with the Noun Project API, handling secret keys, and the get ignore. So I'm just going to go ahead and share the API or the Noun Project API here already so that everybody has access to it while we go through some of the more administrative stuff. If you want to go ahead and start building your account and so on, just in case you're trying to follow along. Now we're going to do a little bit of lecture reading here, specifically this why third-party APIs portion. Can I get somebody to read that first point there?
Handling API requests through a backend framework like Django offers several advantages. Security. By making an API request from the backend, you can help keep sensitive information like API keys, tokens, and credentials hidden from the client-side code. This helps prevent exposing sensitive data to potential malicious actors.
All
Do you want me
right.
to keep going?
No, I would say. Now, when it comes to deciding how is it that you want to speak to your API, if there is a presence of a secret key, that's pretty much a red flag saying, oh, well, if there's something that I have to keep secret, this has to be a server endpoint, or this has to be something that I have to ping from my API, right? The question is, well, why? API keys can be hidden, but I can always hide my API keys for my Vite projects as well. I don't know if we have learned that yet, but Vite does have a way to handle API keys, right? If I go to Vite secrets, keys. It's going to show me this environment variable here. And it shows me a pretty clear example on how to handle environment variables. Okay, well, if there's a way for me to handle environment variables inside of Vite, why is it that it needs to live in my server side? Why can it not live inside of my front end code? Well, although you are hiding your information in regards to version control. So for example, when you go to push your code up to GitHub, you may have something like a git ignore to be able to ignore this .env file so that you're not pushing any of your secret keys or secret information. But once you go to compile your React application is going to actually compile your code, load all of those environment variables as string, and plug them in. So somebody can look into your source code or just open up the inspector tools here. Let's see, take a look at sources, and they can take a look at all of your code and eventually be able to find what your API key is if it's being exposed in the front end. So that's the main issue there, right? If there's a security key, and whether it's an authentication token or just an API key, it must be stalled or it must be contacted. This API must be contacted through a server. All right, so authorization and authentication. Backend frameworks provide robust mechanisms for handling user authentication and authorization by integrating API requests within the backend. You can ensure that only authenticated users with the proper permissions can access and consume the API endpoints. All right, we're going to see this with OAuth. OAuth is going to be a library that we'll be utilizing today for authentication purposes. And again, all this stuff is also available in JavaScript, but it's important for us to remember JavaScript isn't just a front end language, right? There's Node.js, so you can build an entire server in JavaScript. And that's the reason why these tools exist both in Python and JavaScript. If you try to utilize something like OAuth just living within the React application, you may be able to trick it into working by being hosted by the Nginx environment. But more than likely, what you're going to run into is going to be a CORS issue, which is going to be a cross-origin resource sharing issue. We'll talk about that here shortly. All right, so business logic. Backend frameworks allow you to incorporate business logic and data processing before responding to API requests. This flexibility enables to validate, transform, or aggregate data from the third-party API's responses, enhancing the functionality and usability of your application. All right, we're going to do a little bit of an application of this as far as business logic goes. Currently, we're not necessarily running a business, but what we can do is control how this information is to be interacted with. Right? We want to make sure that only specific variables are being passed to that noun project. And we ourselves can control what those variables are. All right. So now course and security policies, cross-origin resource sharing, this is what I mentioned earlier. Policies enforced by web browsers can limit direct API requests made from client-side JavaScript. By making API requests from the backend, you can avoid course-related issues and enforce security policies consistently. We've seen a course-related issue before. When we went ahead and created our Flash server, and we tried to communicate with that Flash server utilizing our index HTML, which was being hosted by Live server, we ended up running into a course issue where a front-end application was trying to contact a backend server. Now we wanted to make our API public, so we went ahead and installed Course. Didn't give it any sort of parameter as to how to handle course orders we just or cross-origin resource sharing, and by default, it allowed communications with all. Well, Course is important because that's what allowed us to actually be able to communicate with our front-end environment. A lot of APIs don't have that capability. A lot of APIs expect a communication with another server. All right. So now abstraction and reusability. By encapsulating API requests within your backend framework, you can create reusable modules or services that handle the interaction with the third-party APIs. This abstraction makes it easier to maintain and modify the API integration logic across your application. All right. Any questions as to why we would utilize a backend to contact a third-party API instead of utilizing our front end?
How does, when it comes to cores, uh, the server that's being data is being requested from, does it know that it's coming from a front end versus a back end?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when the request comes in, there's a client that specifies what kind of host the client is being hosted on. You could expect it in the request. When you go ahead and inspect it in the request, it's expecting a certain pattern that identifies it as a server and a certain pattern that identifies it as a client side, right? If it's something client side and you do not have the application, if you haven't modified the application to have a way to handle client side communication, then it's going to reject it, right? I'm not sure if we remember the HTTP handshake that we talked about a while back ago. Um, but there's a whole handshake that happens between your client and a server where one, it says, hey, can we talk? And in this portion is where those headers are being checked, right? The server is saying, all right, well, let me take a look. Are you coming from a server side or are you a client side? And if you are a client side, do I actually have something explicitly allowing me to talk to you? And then from there, the server responds with yes or no, right? It says yes or no.
Could couldn't you just lie? Couldn't you just have the client adjust its headers to make it look like a server to bypass that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you're trying to do something like that, specific headers that are being passed are not headers that you can interact with JavaScript or with just basic Python code. To accomplish what you just mentioned, or what you're trying to do, you'd have to do quite a bit of interaction with the browser itself,
Okay.
not just the actual application.
Okay, so doable, but it's above and beyond.
Right.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Perfect. If there aren't any other questions, let's go ahead and take a look at the Now project. Let's start getting to know our API. So here they have a get started portion. So I could go over, take a look, and get started. As you can see, I have a couple platoons already created, Whiskey and Tango. I can create another application if I wanted to. Let's go through the process here. All right, what is your application called? We're going to go ahead and name this Avenger Platoon. Tell us what it does. Will generate images for Pokemon X. There you go. And let's go ahead and generate our API key there. All right, so pretty nice interface. Here it is, Avenger Platoon that has been created. It shows me the different limits that I have. It has some historical data as far as how many times I have pinged this API. And if I come down below, here I have a key and a secret key, which I will, since now I have exposed them and will have to publish this on YouTube, I will ensure to regenerate these so that I'm not running into any price or limitations. All right. Something that I think is very important to always take a look at is going to be the API pricing. So here we go. Unlimited royalty-free icon and photo plans. You can see there's an Icon Pro plan, and then there's a Creator Pro, which I'm assuming also allows you to create your own icons. Here it shows you a couple of limitations as to how they work. Um, if you get the basic, it looks like you must attribute the artist, okay? Which that's actually something that I didn't know. All right, black only icons, no editor, lower resolution photos, no photo crops or edits, and no commercials. Whereas in Icon Pro, I get SVGs and PNGs. Looks like I have some sort of access to Mac and PowerPoint, some custom kits. And then finally on the Creator Pro, I get this crop and edit standard photos. and make derivative photo works. So pretty cool stuff to see here. This is all yearly, so it's actually not that bad. $40 a year or 120 bucks a year. If you take a look at monthly plans, it looks like the Creator Pro is not available for monthly, but these are. It makes more sense to get the yearly if you're actually that interested. All right. So there you go. I took a look at some of my pricing information. That's great. I'm gonna come back home. And actually, what I want to look at next is going to be my documentation, which apparently I have lost. Let me see here. Let's go back to API management. There you go. So we just took a look at pricing. I can go back into Avenger Platoon. We took a look at pricing. There's this manage apps tab, which will show me the different apps that I have created. Great. And then they have this documentation tab. All right, so the documentation tab takes me to a completely separate page here. It gives me a couple of headers as to things that I can look at. So here we see the creating an API key. We have an authentication process that's been made for us. It shows us how to make requests. The supported files with HTTP response. Looks like they have another pricing there. That's some sample code, which that's pretty nice. Not a lot of APIs actually have sample code. Unacceptable uses. So this one might be good to read as well, just to make sure that I'm familiar with what it is that I can't do. And then we have some API documentation as far as, oh, they even have an API Explorer. Nice. So I can go ahead and play around in some sort of playground, I'm assuming. Yep. All right. So unacceptable uses, the noun project API, so distributing icons, reselling content, exploiting the noun project users or content, and replicating the noun project. Okay, so replicating the noun project. That's a good one. We got to make sure that our API doesn't do that. Great. Well, let's go into creating an API key. Well, we already saw how the API key is created, right? I have the API key here, and I have my secret key. So that's not necessarily something that I have to read, but let's take a look anyway. All right, so creating an API key, it tells me to go to app management. So great, I do have the right stuff. Now for authentication, it tells me I'm going to need OAuth 1.0. Okay, great. Well, let me go ahead and actually start saving some of this information here. So for as I'm getting to know my API, I know that API keys are located within the management or app management tab. I know that for authentication, I'll be utilizing OAuth 1.0A. We can see you must use your client key and secret key to sign into requests. When accessing, there are many established libraries that will take care of this. There's no need to provide an access token as our API endpoints. Oh, probably shouldn't have done that. As our API endpoints do not yet support granting access to user private data. All right, so we can see a look for some example code. Okay, so it tells me to take a look at some example code. Let me take a look at these established libraries that they're talking about for OAuth. Okay, so for OAuth, it looks like there are some already established libraries. I'm specifically utilizing Python. Okay, and it looks like for Python, I have auth_live and requests auth_live. Okay, well, this is really useful information here. I'm going to actually grab this. I'm going to turn this into a link and paste it there. All right, I just figured out, hey, maybe there's some extra libraries that I may need to install to actually be able to make this request. Okay, let's continue down to making requests. All right, so in making requests, it tells me after authenticating, you can make a request. To make a request, you simply need the endpoint. It's really that simple. All right. And then it shows me some public endpoint and some sample code. Let's take a look at that list of public endpoints. Oh, okay. So that's just going to go down to the API documentation. So we could just take a look at that later. Let me come back here. All right, here's some formats for supported files. So this is something that's going to be really important for me to actually be able to understand. So 404 not found, 401 unauthorized, and then 200 success. So they're not giving me many different status codes that are going to be very descriptive. It looks like I'm going to have to heavily rely on whether I am authorized. And then from there, I'll have to do something that for sure will return a successful response. So I have an example of what a working request looks like. And this 404 not found may return an extra description in the response body. All right, well, it looks like they're just blanketing all errors with a 404 not found, which not ideal, but completely understand. We've already went over prices, unacceptable uses, and here's some good stuff right here. Well, look at that. It's telling me, hey, here's some sample code in Python. Here we can see the import request. Well, let's take a look at what is request. Let's do Python requests. So there you go. So requests, HTTP for humans. Also, I'm going to go ahead and share that here as well. So request looks very similar to Axios from what I can see here. This typically is something that we would label as response, where it would send a request. And then notice how it makes the authentication process there a little bit easier, right? Showing auth is equal to user and password. Okay, great. Beloved features, keep alive. Okay, what if I want to take a look at quick start? So it tells me I can import requests. I can then send a request.get, and then also shows me how to send different post, delete, and likely put requests will follow this parameters as well. Okay, looks like passing parameters in URL. So you can even do something like params.payload instead of actually just writing out the entire URL file. And you can see that that params.payload gets introduced into or it gets translated into the following URL. So that's really cool. That way I don't have to worry about typing it myself. Um, but I'm not going to dive any further into requests. Just really good to know that I can utilize this tool to make my third-party API calls. So again, I'm going to go ahead and link it here as I'm reading through my API documentation so that I'm tracking all the different tools that I can use. Okay. They also have this entire import request from request OAuth live. They have a pretty good way of me being able to interact with this API now. And they show it in a pretty straightforward manner. Well, before I just go ahead and copy and paste this code and try it out, let's go ahead and play around with the playground a little bit. So I come over to the noun project. Looks like they're looking for my API key there. Here's my API key. I'll go ahead and copy it, paste it, copy it, and paste it. All right, so there's my API key. Everything looks great. I mainly care about the get information here. So I can see that I can get an icon by ID. Let's try this get blacklist. Okay, so the blacklist, search terms. It looks like my response code was of 200. So that's good. Came back well. Let's go ahead and ask for an icon ID, which icon ID looks for a data type of integer. Go ahead and pass in one and just see what that does. So here I get an icon, which is trashed by AIGA from the noun project. Great. Here we see the icon URL. I see a question. Give me a second here. And there's my icon being populated. So that's all coming straight from the noun project. Go ahead, Andy.
Just a quick question on the blacklist. Is that like access control blacklist or is another blacklist that I don't know about?
No, let me go ahead and take a look as to what their blacklist actually means. So I'll come down here to API documentation. So blacklist is a cached for 10 minutes. If you recently made changes, they will appear here within 10 minutes. There you go. So this blacklist is looks like it's just a cache storage that you can interact with while you're making requests. That way you don't have to make an entirely new request to have to grab the same exact item. They're just giving you a way as a developer to interact with this information to both keep server requests light and keep client requests light as well. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, great. So now it looks like this version 2 has this ability to get an icon as well. It looks like I can also pass the thumbnail size, but these other parameters seem to be um optional. Okay, great. So now I know how that works. I know how the blacklist works. Let's keep taking a look here. There's this collection with collection ID. This is the one we just tried. Doesn't seem like they have a way for me to just grab by string, which is kind of concerning. Let's take a look here. Oh, so
I
here
think
we
the one
go.
right below that one.
Oh, go ahead, Carlos.
I think the one right below that one you're in, the one that says not complete or something like that.
Yeah, so there's this one here that says query parameters. So it looks like they have version 2 icon. I can pass in some sort of query. So let's go ahead and pass in a query here. Let's say fire and see what that returns. Okay, so first of all, I want to see if my response was successful. So it was. I got a successful response. So I see fire by Civil Pole. And it looks like icons actually returns a list of different thumbnail URLs that I can utilize. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I'm always going to be receiving back a list in my response. Here's the fire URL that was sent in. Oh, that's the wrong thing. So it looks like this is going to be the endpoint that I'll be interacting with the most. It's going to be this v2 get icons. And if I come down below, it actually shows me what the URL looks like. Great. Let me see if I can go ahead and okay, so I can copy this link. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this link address and put source to preferred URL endpoint. All right. So now I have found my URL endpoint that I'm going to be interacting with. I've played around with the Now project and I have identified a couple of tools that I'll be able to utilize to get my project to work. So now that I'm familiar with my Now project, now I can actually start writing code. I can actually start trying to implement this information. The biggest mistake that people do is they just see some sample code, they copy and paste the sample code, and they just try to dive straight into utilizing their API. Believe it or not, this Now project has very extensive documentation in comparison to what you'll see to most APIs. Most APIs do not have all of this information available to you. But whatever information they do have is usually very vital and extremely important that you read so that you understand how how the actual API is working. Please read documentation whenever you're working with an external API before trying to write any code or just don't you're going to make it harder for yourself if you try to go the other end where you're just going to experiment, see what works. It's going to take a lot longer and it's just going to utilize your time inadequately. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start practicing this Now project information. I'm going to go ahead and install a new environment. So I'm going to touch a we're going to call this API playground.py. Notice that that's going to be creating adjacent to my project, is not within my project. And I'm going to go ahead and pip install my new dependencies here. So I'm going to pip install requests, which is something that I know I'm going to use. All right. And then it looks like I'm utilizing OAuth lib. Well, I'm going to go into that OAuth portion there that we found earlier. So I already installed requests. I'm not going to need that anymore. And for OAuth, we'll be utilizing request OAuth lib. So it looks like we have a from request OAuth lib. Great. Installation pip install request OAuth lib. So we already have requests. Now I can pip install requests dash OAuth lib. Great. Now I have my two dependencies. I'm going to go here into my API playground. I'm going to make my API key variable. I'm going to make my secret key variable. And then I'll start writing some code. Let's go ahead and import requests. And let's say from requests OAuth lib import OAuth. Ooh. And it looks like what we'll be utilizing will be OAuth 1. Let's make sure that's correct. Yep, we'll be utilizing OAuth 1. Great. So here we can see the authentication being handled. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and grab it straight from there. So it looks like the first thing they want is going to be my API key. Then it will be my secret key as the secondary argument. The endpoint that I'm working with will be as follows. Let's go back into the noun project. Let's open this up. Here's the endpoint that I'm working with. And we can see that we have a query. So let's just do user input be equal to input. What icon do you want to see? And turn this into an F string that takes in the user input. Actually, first, let's make sure that we run something that we already know works. Once we run something that we know works, then we can move forward. All right. So I've created my OAuth lib. Here's my endpoint. Let's go ahead and continue going down through this process here. It looks like I can then send my request. So I can say response is equal to request dot get. I can pass in my endpoint and specify that my authentication is going to be my OAuth authentication. And then finally, let's go ahead and print response dot content. Take a look at what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and run Python API playground. See if that executes. Okay, well, this didn't execute. I'm getting a documentation type. So there's actually HTML. And what it's giving me is a 403 forbidden. It says you don't have the permission access to the access the request. You don't have the permission to access the requested resource. It is either read protected or not readable by the server. Interesting.
You
So,
didn't pass any actual secret keys, right?
oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So currently I don't have any secret keys. So let's go ahead and adjust that here. Let's grab our secret keys. Here's my API key. Here's my secret key. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and try our playground one more time. Nice. Well, now that I did it through my playground, it looks like everything is printing. It's a pretty much a mess, which is okay. From what I saw inside of this playground that they provided for us, we know that it comes in a list named icons. But something else to specify here is this is a binary string yet again. So now we also know that we're going to need JSON, and I can turn this into body equals JSON dot loads response dot content. From there, I can print body dot get icon, which is going to get me that icon key and return that list. I can then access index 0, and then I can go into the thumbnail URL. So dot get thumbnail URL. Let's execute this request one more time. Okay, so it looks like index 0, it didn't like that. And that's because I put get icon instead of get icons. Great. So now I was able to work perfectly fine. I open up that PNG, and there we have our Fire PNG being populated. So I just integrated the application of this third-party API. Let's make it a little bit more dynamic now. Let's accept some user input there, and let's change this query to include the user input. I'm going to go ahead and clear it. Then I'm going to run Python API Playground. Okay, so what is it I want to see? Let's say I want to see water. And there's the water. If I run it one last time and I put something crazy and off the wall, I guess gibberish would be the only crazy thing that I could think of. It returns a list index out of range. All right, perfect. So icons must be an empty list. Let's see what happens here. Let's see. Let me go into my playground. Let me change my query. So it still returns icons. It doesn't actually return an error. And look that the response code is still 200. So even though I expected something like a 404 not found, it still processes my request. It just returns an empty list. So I can have some sort of if statement there. So I can say if body.get icons, and we know that an empty list is falsy, and one with a value is truly, else I can print this image does not exist. Or I can try it out one more time, type in some gibberish, and I get this image does not exist. Great. Everything's working well. I have my playground now implemented. I've seen what sort of Python code it is that I need to use, and I've even made my interaction with it a little bit more dynamic. Well, now let's actually complete the circle. All right, let's plug it into our server. I'm gonna change directories into my Pokédex project. And inside of my Pokédex project, I'm gonna go ahead and make a new app. I'm gonna say Python manage py start app and call this my API app. Now, inside of my API app, I'm gonna go ahead and code my views.py. So my views.py should look pretty similar to what I have on the left-hand side. I'm going to go ahead and run that handy dandy copy and paste, which I don't really like to do very often. All right, so there we go. We have our import of request. We have our request OAuth lib, but currently this is not an API view. Well, let's change that. We know that I need to say from REST framework dot views. I want to import API view from REST framework dot response. I want to import response. Awesome. Everything else stands the same. I can turn this into a class. Say class noun project API. I know that this is going to inherit from the API view. And I know that it's going to need a getter method, which will take in self and a request. And just like that, I've turned that one Python script into an API view. I still have the endpoint that I'm looking for. I still have my keys that I'm trying to ensure are working correctly. And I have a way of handling this position. So now I can just change this print statement for a response and have it return. So we'll either return the thumbnail or return a response. All right. We haven't gone into HTTP statuses just yet, so I don't want to integrate that. But please be aware that in here, you would also apply something like saying, hey, the new status is 404 not found. All right. Well, the next portion is being able to capture this user input. It's no longer going to be a terminal program. So how else could I capture that user input?
Are you talking like a text box with a submit button?
Okay, so the user pops up a text box, they write their user input, and they click submit, an on-click function happens, right? A post request, a get request comes through, and then it gets processed by my server. How do on the server side, grab that user input from that request?
You need to make an API endpoint.
Yeah, so it would come from the endpoint itself, right? And in the endpoint, we can name it something like user input. We can remove this portion there. And now we can see the complete application there just coming in. Well, let's work backwards now. Here's my views. You just mentioned that I would need an API endpoint. So maybe I do something like touch urls.py, code urls.py. And here I say from Django.urls, import path, establish my URL patterns, and then say, hey, for the path, I expect a string, which will be known as user input. And this will then route to the noun project API. Send it. Go ahead, Andy.
For the URL patterns, does it have to be named specifically in that form, URL patterns? Because when I did an underscore URL underscore patterns, it gave me an error.
It does have to be specifically URL patterns.
Okay.
Yes.
And then the second question, and when you said I started to make connect the dots here. When you said API endpoint, the URLs and the paths that the URLs file shows, those are API endpoints.
Those are your API endpoints, yes, as you're creating them. All right, so there we have our URL patterns. We have our ability to receive string. And now I can come over to the Pokédex project and finish tying in the dots, right? I can come here and say path of API slash v1 slash noun slash, and I wanted to include my API app dot URLs. The final thing I need to do is come over to settings and integrate that API app. Okay, well, let's try it out. I'm going to change directories. I'm going to run my server. It looks like I don't have any issues. Notice that I didn't have to make any migrations for that new app because there is no models inside of it. I can close up my settings there. And I can actually type it into my browser. Let's go ahead and go to http://127.0.0.1 port 8000. I'm going to go to API/v1 slash nouns slash fire, which is what I wanted to send out. Okay, well, now when I send this request, we can see that it goes to the noun project API. All right, so the request goes through all the way to nouns. It then goes into my include method, which goes to my API URLs, where the string of user input is being taken as a URL parameter. So fire becomes that user input. It then goes to my views. My user input is used by my function, or excuse me, my method of get. I then authenticate my keys. My endpoint gets created utilizing that user input. And then a response gets generated upon sending a request. Well, in Axios, whenever I sent a request, I had to utilize something like async await. Well, Python and JavaScript run differently. Python actually processes requests in an asynchronous method by default. There are such a thing as asynchronous functions inside of Python, but they're not something that you have to explicitly state when handling requests. We then grab the body, generate a response, and return our thumbnail, which we can then open. There's the thumbnail from the Noun Project API. All right, I see a hand go up. Go ahead, Carlos.
So, and I don't know if we just haven't gotten to it or if this is how it's going to go, but you said since we're doing this on the server side, that's why we don't have to hide the API key and secret key.
We still have to hide it.
Or, okay, we still have to hide it. Okay.
Yes, that hasn't been done yet. All
Got
right.
it. Thank you.
Of course. Andy?
This is related to cache. I'm wondering if upon like app restart, it's gonna continuously request stuff, but I like that the API has its own cache. I don't know how it works, but it seems like it's trying to stop you from flooding it. I was wondering, is there a way to create your own cache and make it kind of hold the value or whatever for a certain amount of time so that you don't have to continuously request it?
Yeah, so Django has something called caching. You can add it as a decorator. I don't believe it comes from an outside library. I think there are different caching tools from outside libraries specifically for Django. But you could add a cache to all of your API views. Excuse me, first. And then once you have all that caching inside of all your functions, as people make requests to it, your server will automatically cache that information. And rather than processing all of your logic, every time that API endpoint gets hit with the same exact parameters, it'll just return that cache response.
And then that makes sense. And then the follow-up question is, if you are constantly re having to rely on the API for the icons, um, I'm assuming if your app's not going to work if it's not connected to the internet, right? Or or the API is down, unless you have like an alternate thing to show for it if the API is down.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if the API goes down, you would essentially run out of resources to demonstrate there. So you'd have to have some sort of backup image or something to just fill in the blank in case the API goes down.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. Awesome. Well, everyone, we've been going on for quite a while. Before we move on into part two, I want to go ahead and give us all a break. There are no in-between assignments for today. I'll go ahead and push this up to GitHub. And yes, I am aware those keys are exposed. Please don't worry, I will regenerate those keys. So I'll go ahead and send this up to GitHub so everybody has it in case you're trying to follow along. If you haven't been trying to follow along, then I would recommend that you try to catch up. Let's go ahead and take a nice 30-minute break. Currently, right now, it is 9:52. Let's return at 10:25 and continue on with part two of our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll see everyone back shortly. All right, welcome back, everyone. So right before we left, we went ahead and pushed over the Noun Project API. Currently, we're able to ping our API. We're able to send different elements or different arguments here. So if I were to come over, and actually this would fail because I'm currently not running my server. So let me go ahead and change directories here. Oh, that's the wrong terminal. It is running. All right. If I come over here and I put something like Michael, let's see what that returns. So for Michael, more than likely we're gonna get one of the Ninja Turtles. Oh, never mind. We get a person with a mask. I think it's Raphael that returns the Ninja Turtle. Let me try that. Raphael. Yeah, it is Raphael. There you go. So Raphael will return one of the Ninja Turtles. So we're able to send different parameters over in our URL pattern, receive them back, send them as a query over to the Noun Project API, and return to the client the actual API, or excuse me, the actual PNG that they can then render on screen. Awesome. Well, currently right now, although my function is almost complete, I need to hide my APIs and secret keys. Well, how do I go about doing that? In order to do that, the best way that I have seen it done, and actually I'm going to control C here, a couple of things that I need to make sure I update. So one, my requirements. I'm going to go ahead and run pip freeze requirements txt to make sure all of my requirements have been updated since I currently shouldn't have OAuth lib and now I should. So there's request and request OAuth lib now have been added, which I didn't have before. And the next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a .env file. Now, .env files are special. They're special in the essence that they can interact with your environment. But what I mean by this, let's go and take a look at what a .env is. Let's call this my variable. And let's make this Francisco says hello. So currently this is a .env file. It says Francisco says it says hello, and it doesn't really have anything special. If I click ls here, it's not going to show because it's a dot file. So I have to click ls-a, and then I can see the .env presence. But what's the meaningfulness besides this .env? Well, if I do something like source.env and I run it, and then I run echo my var, you'll see that I get back an output inside of my shell saying Francisco says hello. Well, there's two commands that were executed. One, the source command, and the second one, the echo command. We've utilized source before whenever working with Python environments, where we specify, hey, the Python interpreter that we're going to be utilizing is going to be inside here, and we can see that a Python environment gets activated. Well, what actually runs the activation function is that activate script. That's what interacts with the shell and creates this parentheses with the display of which Python environment is being utilized. But the source function or method, all it does, the source command, is it actually finds and loads a environment variable, right? Or something that will interact with your current environment. So in this case, what I created is a .env file, meaning, hey, this is going to interact with my environment. Well, by running source.env, then I have access to all of the variables that I've established here. As if I were to do something like foo is equal to hi, and I run this, I can run echo foo, and you can see that it returns hi. A little bit of ZSH here, or bash that we're learning. Well, if I say that there is a bye that is equal to goodbye, and then I run echo bye, it doesn't return anything. Why is that?
Because you never established the buy.
Okay, well, I established it here on line
You
two.
didn't source it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't source it. I didn't load it into my environment, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and do source.env again. And then afterwards, I can echo bye. And now we get goodbye being placed onto the screen. All right. Now, oh, go ahead, Carlos.
I guess I could test this out myself, but if you were to do, does it basically just let you run one command and then it kind of goes away? So if you were to try and do echo by again, would you get a blank or would you actually get by or a goodbye?
No, I would still get goodbye. Yeah, so doing this source command just created these environment variables. So now these variables exist within this terminal, not the other though. If I come in here, which is a separate terminal instance, and I say echo bye, you'll see that it comes up empty.
I was just trying to figure out why in the other one, after you did the first one, then you did what you did what was it? Yeah, it basically went away. So you did foo, you established foo, and then you tried to do buy again and it didn't come up. So did it like deactivate or what happened?
Yeah, so it didn't deactivate. The first time that I did the source, the only environment that existed was my variable. I then wrote the bye afterwards.
So you just reloaded.
Exactly. Right. It's not something that's just going to happen automatically. If there is a change to my .env file, I have to manually source it again.
Perfect. Thanks.
Of course. All right. Well, now why go down this whole tantrum over what a .env file is and why even talk about this .env file?
Stick your
Well,
secret keys in there.
exactly. I can store all of my environment variables in here. And let me actually do a little bit of tying up here. So inside of the secret key, I'm going to actually import OS, or inside of this API views, I apologize. I'm going to import OS. And I know that I'm going to be working with a Python virtual environment here, but we'll do that here shortly. I'll go ahead and print os.environ.get, and I'm going to pass in foo. Let me go ahead and run this project here. Python, manage py, run server. All right, so you'll see that foo is currently none. That's where that print statement's coming from. So I'll go ahead and say, hey, foo. Well, what's going on here? Why isn't it able to recognize something that I have created? Right? If I go to, say, my var, and then it runs, I still get none, even though I'm trying to interact with my environment. Well, in Python, there's a way to interact with our environment, but it's going to be utilizing an external library called .env. And from there, what we're going to do is we're going to grab a load.env function. So I'm going to go ahead and, first of all, I'll copy these over, bring them over to my env. And the common standard when inside of these files is to have them all in capital letters. Now, you also don't want spaces in between these equal signs and your quotation marks. No spaces and all in capital letters. All right, so now I've moved my files a little bit. Let's go ahead and finish connecting the dots here. I'm getting to pip install python-.env. That's going to install one new dependency. From there, I'll say from .env, I want to import load.env. Now this load.env, what does it do? Let's see. So this import, so if both .env paths and stream are none, find .env. All right, it doesn't tell me what it does. This load.env file will so load.env function will take in a path relative to a .env file and load the variables to the environment to allow OS to pull environment variables, such as secret keys. So now if we go into applying this, I'll go ahead and say load.env, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to the .env file. Okay, now I say relative. If it's a relative path, and I'm taking a look here, why is it that I'm not going back a directory to route to that .env file?
Is it just taking it under your project? So anything under your project, it's the first directory that it'll look at?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, it could be that way as well. Which one of these files is my entry point to my entire project?
Your top Pokédex project?
That's going to be my directory, right? But which one of these files?
Manage.
Yeah, manage.py. When I run my server, I say Python manage.py run server. When I
So
start
it's got to be relative to manage py.
exactly. Everything has to be in relation to manage.py. All right. So then I do my load.env. I get that OS there. Well, now let's go ahead and try that print statement one more time. Let's do print os.environment.get. We know that my var works. Let me echo it in here as well. So echo my var. Okay, so Francisco says hello. That works great. I go back to my views, and I'm gonna go ahead and type in my var. Well, now when I run my server, you'll see that my var, the print statement, says Francisco says hello. So I was actually able to load my environment variables now. And because I'm able to load my environment variables, well, I can change my API key and secret keys. So let me go ahead and do that here really quickly by changing it to os.environ.get. Both of them end with key, so I'm just going to save myself some typing there. This is going to be my API key, and this is going to be my secret key. Let's make sure that that's what I named them. API key, secret key. Great. I can make sure that both of them work. Let's go ahead and print them. Let's do print API key and secret key. Let's send this request one more time. So there's my print statement for my API key and secret key. Everything worked great. Now we can see that if I were to change, oh, hello, wrong line. We can see that if I were to change a parameter there, so let's say I change Raphael for, oh man, I could think of something. Let's go with pool. Well, pool was successful. And if I open it up, I get an icon for a pool. And there you go. I have now successfully hidden my API and secret key. Well, is it hidden? It's no longer in my backend code. So that's pretty hidden. But what about this .env file? As of right now, Git doesn't know how to handle this .env file. Remember, Git, all it's doing is keeping an eye on the project and seeing any changes that happen. Currently, there's been a new file that was created, and it's had a couple of insertions inside of it. Now, unfortunately, we are going to run into an issue here. If I go into Pokédex and I type in git status, you're going to see that it's not keeping track of this .env file. The only reason why it's not keeping track of this .env file is because we have a parental .getignore in the entire GitHub repository that's already accounting for .envs. So that's the reason why this isn't green or showing up here as a new file added. You guys don't have that. So in order to tell Git to ignore something, I need to create a .getignore file. So I can run touch.getignore. And again, this .getignore, you'll realize that it has its own little icon there, which is a little bit different than what our .env file does. And here, I can specify something like, I want you to ignore an env file. Now, there's a couple of other things that you might want to account for whenever you create a .getignore. For example, this PyCache, very annoying and happens in almost every single project that you'll create that has a module aspect attached to it. So I would add that PyCache. You can also take a look at here if you do python.getignore. You can see that I've visited this a couple of times. You could just go to the process of copying and paste this if you'd like, but essentially all of this information are things that you really do not need inside of your repository, right? You don't want this stuff to get actually pushed up. You can see there's environments here, .env for an actual environment. In case somebody created a virtual environment, the typical standard is to name it .venv for virtual environment. If somebody didn't add a dot into it, this is accounting for that. So they do a couple of different standards as far as how people go about naming their environments. In case you yourself didn't ensure to add it correctly. So now by adding this .env in this PyCache directory will no longer get pushed up to GitHub. And this .env file will not get pushed up to GitHub. That way, my secret keys are not exposed in GitHub either. And I don't have to privatize my repository. I can still leave it public because nobody has access to my actual local machine. All right. There's one last secret key that I have to take care of, and that's here in settings. In settings, there you go. You'll find a secret key. I'm going to go ahead and add this to my .env file. I'm going to name this Django secret key since I have a couple of secret keys now. And in my settings, I can type in os.environ. I need to import OS again. So we could do os.environ.get and then pass in Django secret key. And actually, I'm going to do a little bit of experimenting here. I want to see what happens when I run this code here. All right, so I'm going to execute my folder. So let's do Python manage py run server. Well, my server tries running. Oh, this is wrong terminal. All right, so my server runs, but notice that I'm getting a print statement for none. Then I get none again, and then it runs successfully. Interesting. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more description here so I can make sure that that's correct. So we're seeing secret is none. Why do we think that's happening? Let's come back over to the views inside of our API app. And in here, let's just go ahead and print and do os.environ.get and do API key. And actually, I'm going to move this outside of the view so that it's triggered every time. All right. I'm going to quit it, and then I'm going to run my server. So I'm getting secret is none twice. And then I'm seeing my API key.
Does it have something to, with the built-in Django being a secret key? Like, does Django have its own built-in functionality to recognize it, that it's a key that you shouldn't be printing?
No. Actually, what's going on here is the order in which things are executed. So what we established so far is that manage py is the entry point to my project. But what's the next script that gets executed?
Settings.
It's settings.py, right? So currently, my load.env file doesn't happen until later on. So let's go ahead and take this load.env and let's implement it in settings. And now let's see what happens when I crash my server and then run it. Well, now we see the secret Django key. Here's my print statement happening, and it's actually loading the correct secret key. And then we see my API key. Well, in my views, I never have to load the environment. That's because the very first script that gets executed after running manage.py is secret, or excuse me, is settings.py. So I only have to load my environment once, and the best place to do it is inside of settings.py. All right. The reason why I'm going so in detail into explaining the order and the process of how this happens is because this is a common issue that we see during personal projects when it comes to actually loading environment variables. All right. Any questions over how to handle secret keys or how to load your environment variables into your Django application? All right. If there aren't any questions, then I'm going to go ahead and crash my server here. I'm going to change directory one back, come over to my API playground. And here, I want to demonstrate a tool that will allow us to view this body in a much better format than what it's currently being printed in now. Because currently, if I run the following, let's go ahead and say Python API playground. Let's go with fire. Well, my information comes back, but this isn't something that's human readable. Having to parse through this dictionary, um, although possible, very confusing and kind of a pain. Now, currently, we were able to use the API Playground, and because of the API Playground, we were able to get things working correctly because they give me a nice, readable example of the information that I'm looking for. All right, I can come back here and actually put fire, try it out, and you can see it coming back correctly. Well, what if the API I'm currently working with doesn't have this availability, and I don't have a playground? I don't get something to play online to figure out how it works. And all I can do is interact with it through my terminal. I don't want to go through the process of trying to explore every single one of them just to figure out how things are nested. Instead, I would like a better visual representation of my actual response. Now, in JavaScript, we have a really nice representation of it because in JavaScript, I can just, let's see. I'm not going to go through the process of making a fetch request here. But in JavaScript, whenever a response comes back, it's very readable on my terminal. If I'm using it in my console, it comes in nice little drop-down menus that I can open up. But Python doesn't give me that ability. And it's also a server side. So if I'm working on this on the actual cloud where it's being served, I'm not going to have anything other than a terminal to see the output. Well, we can fix this by utilizing PrettyPrint from Python. So we can go into Python, PrettyPrint, and here we can see there's PrettyPrinter. Takes in a couple of data types, and it has a couple of examples over how it's used. Another really cool library to use is Rich. It allows you to like make tables, have richer text, all kinds of different things. So if you ever have like a job opportunity where they want you to make a terminal-based program, take the extra time to dive into what Rich can do for you, how you can make your terminal program look, although it is still a terminal program, you can make it have a nice terminal UI rather than just black and white the entire time. So just two tools to keep in mind whenever you're working here. All right. Well, I want to implement PrettyPrint. And when I implement PrettyPrint, I want to make it nice and readable. There's nothing that I have to actually install. It's already built into Python. I can just import PrettyPrint. And from there, I can create an instance of PrettyPrint. So I can say pp is equal to PrettyPrint dot PrettyPrinter. So again, I'm diving into PrettyPrint, and actually I could just say from preprint import PrettyPrinter. That looks a little bit more legible there. And for pretty printer, well, all it expects is the indent and the depth, right? It only cares about the indent. That one's actually a required argument, but the width is not required. I can specify how far I actually want it to display, and I can specify the depth. So how many key value pairs in depth is it that I want it to go in? Well, let's take out, let's check out the indent. By indent, I want it to be 2. And then for width, let's do something as simple as 5. And then for depth, let's just do 2 first, just so we could see it. And then we'll change up how everything comes in. Well, now, instead of just printing my body, I can change this to pp dot pretty print my body. Let's go ahead and run my playground again. And instead of utilizing this user input, I'm just going to pass in fire since we know that works. Oh, and I need to comment this out. Okay, so we run the API playground, and look at that. It looks completely different. Now I have some actual readable format. And if I scroll all the way up to the top, okay, so it looks like my width was a little too far because 10 kind of knocked out that very first initial indent there. So I'm going to take off that width argument altogether and run it with its default. Run my API key, or excuse me, my API call. And here it is. So here's Francisco's playground. Okay, notice that my depth is only of 2. So it only shows me 1 key and 1 value worth of depth. Right? So key, value. So depth 1 would be the keys inside that very first dictionary. If I run it again, you'll see that it just comes back with generated at, icons, next page, total. Okay, well, I know that I want to take a look at icons, but I would like to see what's inside of icons, because as of now, it just tells me it's a list. But it's a list of what? Well, if I run it again, I can see it's a list of dictionaries. Okay, great. Well, instead of body, I can do body.get icons. Run my request again. And now, maybe I want to change this to, instead of being 2 in depth, I only want to see 1 in depth, and I just want the keys and values that are in there. Okay, so it looks like icons doesn't work that way. I could do icons index 0, and then that would work. Okay, so now it's showing me only the 1 keys and values. So I have attributions, collections, creators, so on, and there's my fancy dandy dumb URL. Right, so just an easier, more readable way to work with my responses whenever they're coming back from an API. I want to make sure that they're not exposed per se, or that they're not super nested or super difficult to read. So instead of just leaving it blank, I'm going to bring in Pretty Printer so I can work with it inside of my server. Does anyone have any questions about how we implemented Pretty Print? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions. For the last portion of our test here, or excuse me, for the last portion of our lesson here, we're going to go over how to test this interaction. Testing that our URL is actually sending a request and returning a response. Now, I'm actually going to delete these here. Okay, great. leave that there for everybody in case you want to utilize this at any point. All right. So in my API app, in views, I'm actually sending a request. And so far, what we've written so far, or as far as testing goes, are called unit tests. Right? We've been utilizing unit tests pretty much throughout the entire program. The only time we wrote end-to-end test was when we utilized Cypress, because Cypress was actually pinging an API. It was mocking all of our utilities. Cypress is an end-to-end framework. There's integration test, which is testing the ability to have API call successfully work by actually pinging the API. And then there's unit test, where you can also write unit test for your API, but you would essentially mock the request. Now, why would I want to mock my request for my unit test rather than actually sending the request itself?
You're going to be pinging the API a whole bunch.
Exactly. Yeah, unit tests are supposed to be quick, effective, and very low in cost. So if they're supposed to be very low in cost, I definitely don't want to run into some sort of limitations or drive my API crazy and tell me, hey, you know what, you're pinging us way too much. Um, you've hit your cap for this month, unless you pay this certain amount per additional request. I don't want none of that. So instead, when I write this test, I'm going to mock my request. Let's go into how we would do that. I'm going to go into my test directory. So change directory into Pokedex project, tests, and in here, I'm going to make a test API.py. And I'm going to code that test API.py. Now, this test isn't going to be much different from what we've seen before. I'm going to start by saying from REST framework dot test. I'm going to import API client. And then from Django.test, I want to import test case. Now, before what we utilized whenever we were sending a request was the client that comes in built in with Django. In this case, I am actually interacting with an additional third-party API. So I want to utilize the API client, not the client that comes in with Django. All right. Let's go into building this test. So I say class, noun, project, API, test, and this is test case. Here, if I'm going to have multiples of the instances of this client, I could do something called a setup method. And I can pass in self and say self.client is equal to API client. And the self method is almost the same thing as the init method. It creates class level attributes to utilize in multiple tests. So now I can call that client in multiple methods. Well, let's go into creating our method here. I'm gonna have my function of test, noun, project, search, which will take in self. I'll say that the search parameter or the user input is equal to fire, which is what we've seen up to this point. I could have a preview URL, which we can grab from our playground here that I closed. This one. Oh, this one's for the pool. We can do this. All right, so we grab the pool. There's our PNG, what we expect to come back. And now we can actually build our test. All right, so I can say response is equal to self.client, which is going to send a get request to a reverse. And I need to import that from Django or excuse me, from Django URLs. I apologize. From Django.urls, import reverse, and I don't think I need resolve, so I'm going to do reverse. Where it's expecting a name and the arguments, which in this case, the arguments that I'm going to be passing in will be the preview URL, or excuse me, the user input. Well, interesting. Let's see, this is going to reverse. Let me take a look at the API, go over to URLs. I never gave it a name, so let me add one in there. Name, I'm going to say API noun. Go back to my test view and apply API noun. So that's going to send my request. I will then have a response. I know that I'm going to need JSON because I'm going to have a binary string. So I can say if with self.subtest, let's say response.status code and 200. Let's do self.assert equal. All right, so it's going to make sure that the status code was successful. From there, I can go ahead and grab the body. Which is going to load the content of the body. And then finally, I can go ahead and check if the preview URL matches. Or excuse me, yeah, if the preview URL matches. So I can say self.assert equal that body.get icons at index 0 dot get thumbnail URL is the same thing as my preview URL. Well, let's come back to my management here in development. I can refresh it to see where I'm currently at. Okay, so cumulative, I don't have much. I'm going to go into daily here. So currently I've made 24 calls. Well, I wonder what happens when I run this test case here. So I'm going to change directory one back and run Python, manage py, test, tests, and this is going to be test API. All right, so I see that it failed, which is okay. Body.get. So string object has no attribute.get. All right. JSON.loads, which is body. Okay, good. Let me see here. There seems to have been an issue. Let me go ahead and print the body to see what that looks like. And then self.assert true. True. At this point, I'm a little bit into debugging mode. I apologize, everyone. Interesting. So it looks like when I send it through the API client, the only thing that comes back is the thumbnail URL. That doesn't make any sense. Couple of print statements there. Oh, that's actually true. Yeah. So when you're sending it with the API client, by default, it comes back with just the thumbnail URL. I'm going to have to take a look as to why that is happening. There's no link to this preview URL, so it's not like there's some sort of assumption that's happening in there. I need to dig into what the API client is doing to cause this behavior. So in any case, this made my life a little easier because now I can just call this my response URL and check if that is true. Okay, so I run it, I get my okay, everything passed. Currently it's 24. Well, I ran it like 6 or 7 times, so I do expect it to change. Okay, so it looks like it's giving it to me hourly now. Let me change it to daily. So now I'm at 28 calls. Okay. So we can see how this noun project, even though all I'm doing is running a unit test, it's still pinging the API and still driving up my API request. So this is not a unit test. This is an example of an integration test, right? It's integration because it's actually pinging my backend API. Well, how do I fix that? How do I actually turn it into a unit test by mocking a response? Well, this is where stuff gets a little bit more tricky than what we've already seen so far. I know. It just keeps getting better and better, right? Well, in here, we're going to actually import something new. We're going to go into unit test, which is already built into Python. And I'm going to bring in mock. From there, I'll import patch. Now, what does that patch do? Notice that it's in blue, so it's not a function. It looks like it's just a variable. Well, mock is a class. Let's check out mock. Oh, never mind. Mock seems to be a file. Let's just check out patch. So patch is a variable holding patcher. And patcher is a class that takes in a test prefix. Here's the call method. So every time it's utilized, it's looking for a target. It has an overload method. So it looks like this is going to be a decorator for what I can see here. So let's apply it as a decorator and see how that works. Well, in here, I'm going to say patch. I'm going to patch a functionality. Well, what is it that I want to patch? I want to patch the functionality of requests.get. Where's that coming from? Let's see here. Well, in views, I am utilizing request.get to execute my request over to my URL endpoint. So here in my test API, request.get is mocking this information here. So I'm saying, hey, I'm going to mock this request now. All right. Let's go into mocking my actual response, or what would my response in mock look like? So I'm going to say mock response. And this is going to get a little bit advanced on us. I'm going to declare a brand new type and its object. So here, the type that I'm creating will be of mock response. Almost like creating a class named mock response. This is a brand new object that will be of application JSON. This application JSON will have a body that looks as such. I'm going to open it up a little bit here. It's going to have Self. Oh, here's the body. Great. When it comes back, we know that there is icons. Inside of icons, there should be a list of objects, or excuse me, of dictionaries, where the dictionary of thumbnail URL will be placed in, where the preview URL will be found. So this is no longer pinging the actual API. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that my view, when given this example of a response, it can execute properly and return my preview URL. Well, let's put it side to side. Oh, go
There's a
ahead.
typo in something.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was gonna say you have a typo where the thumbnail is.
Thank you. All right. So now, let's see here. So instead of actually sending my request, this response will automatically get filled in with this body. Now, this body, I can see that I'm looking for a key of icons. So icons is there. Inside of icons, I'm going into index 0. So I expect a list of index 0, which returns this dictionary. And then I'll grab the thumbnail URL, which is what I'm grabbing here. .get thumbnail URL and returning that preview URL value. So everything looks like it's working well. I've created a type for a mock response. I have my patch, which is happening for that request. But now, how do I actually execute this mock? Interesting. Let me see here. Oh, there you go. Well, when I went ahead and added this patcher up here, I'm actually going to add a second attribute called mock get, because this patch is mocking a get request. And this is all happening with my mock that I'm coming down here. So now what I can do is I can say mock get dot return value. And this return value will be of my mock response. Okay, so the patcher takes out my request.get from my API view. All right, it's going to say, hey, you're no longer going to be utilizing this. Well, where's the connecting file there? How do I connect this patch to my actual method? Well, I connect this patch to my method by passing it in as an attribute of mock get. So instead of executing request.get, my view will actually function with patch.get. And that is not very clear here, but I hope you guys could see that patch.get being highlighted over. Okay, so now I'm saying, hey, oh, excuse me, not patch.get. It's supposed to be mock underscore get. So now it's saying mock get will return the value of the mock response that I've created here. And then the function will continue. It will load it into actual JSON.loads. It will then check if there is an icons, which we know does exist. And from there, it'll dive into returning that thumbnail URL. Okay, great. There's nothing much more that we have to change here. Let's make sure that this still works by running our test here. I'm going to run Python manage py. I'm just going to go up here. Test API. looks like I'm getting an error here. And that's happening in response.content because I'm utilizing JSON.loads. So mock response object has no attribute content. Okay. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and take a look at what response looks like. Why are you throwing an error for response.content? Oh, so the error is actually happening inside of my view. Let me check here. Doing a little bit of debugging, everybody. I apologize. So it looks like mock response is an object that's coming back, but it doesn't have content inside of
Yeah.
it.
Can you scroll up on the left-hand side in your
Mhm.
test API? So your mock response, it looks like if I understand it correctly, which I probably don't, it looks like there's just an icons attribute that has a list afterwards with a thumbnail URL. Do you have to mock the content?
It looks
Like,
like it. That's what I was thinking as well. Let me try it out. Let's see. Content. All right. Let's see what that looks like now. Yeah, so it looks like it continues to say mock response has no attribute named content. Interesting. Well, I don't want to waste everybody's time here, so go ahead and let's go ahead and pause the recording. Give me 7 minutes to try to debug this, and then we'll come back and figure this out, everybody. All right, so just a small addition that we did here is we actually grabbed the noun project response. We're gonna go ahead and copy and paste it. This is coming straight from the playground, right? So we copy it, we pasted it, and now it's inside of our answers file. Now to finish off our test, I'm gonna say from tests.answers, import that noun project response. All right, so now I have that noun project response. And I'm actually going to go and rewrite some of this information. So for example, I want my data to be equal to my noun project response. That's the data that I'm going to be using. So rather than having this lambda function and trying to create a class this way, we're going to create a class the way that we're more accustomed to. I'm going to say class of mock response, which will have an init method that takes in self and data. We'll then pass in self.content to be equal to JSON.dumps data. And then we'll go ahead and encode said data to UTF-8. Now, why are we doing this? Well, inside of my view is expecting a response to come back. But when it grabs that response, it's expecting there to be an attribute named content. So it's expecting a class attribute. Not only that, but I'm utilizing JSON.loads. So I can't just give it an already loaded dictionary. I have to actually dump it back and encode it into UTF-8. Now, with that fix, I can go ahead and say, well, my mock get, or excuse me, my mock response is equal to an instance of mock response where we pass in the data from the noun project API. Now we can have that as our return value, send the reverse request, and let's take a look at what response looks like now. Well, now we're getting okay. We can see the response is application type JSON. If we take a look at response.content, we now see that response.content is returning a binary string with some information in there. Let's see what's going on here. Interesting. Let's try running our test and see what it does here. Okay, so we go to json.loads, response.content, grabs that preview URL, and ensures that it all works properly. And now, if we go ahead and take a look at our tracker here, which shows us how we're doing historically, and let's do this on a daily basis, which now I'm at 29 calls. Well, if I execute this again, this seems to have worked correctly. And if I refresh it, go back to daily, we're still at 29 calls. So I'm no longer actually pinging my API through my unit test. Instead, I am mocking the behavior of sending this request, utilizing patch, which is coming in from unit test.mock. That gives me access to this mock get attribute that I'm passing into this method. From there, I create a class called mock response where I'm dumping the data that's coming back as a response that I have here in answers. I am dumping the data in JSON and encoding it with UTF-8. So now it's no longer Python code. It's actually just JSON readable code. I do that here where I create an instance of that mock response. And I say, hey, for mock get, which is request.get, the value that we'll be returning will be the mock response class. Well, in my views, the mock response class gets processed. It loads it, and it returns the icon. So now when I go ahead and check my response URL, I can go ahead and assert that my response URL is the same as the preview URL, which is coming back, or which is the response that's coming back from my actual code. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how we wrote this unit test for testing our noun project? And I do want to preface this by saying that testing or this unit test of mocking is an advanced topic. We are introducing it. You do not need to necessarily achieve mastery over this, and it will not be part of your assessment. Right? You're not going to have a portion in your assessment that's expecting you to pass a mock test. So please don't be too concerned about that portion. Just try to get familiarized with this. And if there's anything that you get out of this portion of the lecture, is understanding that integration tests for third-party APIs can be achievable. They just have to be mocked and not actually ping the API itself. Otherwise, it's an integration test. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions? Go ahead, Michael.
If you were like paying for this API to have free pings, or like, not free but included, would you still care? Would there be like any benefit to doing this, or would you just want to ping it as much as you want for the test?
Yeah, so the benefit would be speed in that case.
Okay.
If you just want something that's quick, so your unit test should be quick, and in that case, cost would kind of go out the window. I would write unit test just to ensure logic is working correctly. But if you really have no limitation, I would heavily rely on integration test more than anything to ensure that everything's passing through.
Okay.
All right, Daniel.
This one's kind of like for the personal project as well. I see that that API has a 5,000 limit per month. Would something with that extensive of amount of calls be okay to be used in our personal projects, or should we shy away from it?
It's definitely good to include it in your personal projects. I think, like Andy mentioned earlier, just make sure you take into accountability the possibility that it might run out of calls. If you are making this into a portfolio project that you're going to actively be sending out and presenting, one, make sure that you have that backup plan, and two, monitor the actual API so that if it does break, maybe move it to the bottom of your resume or don't present it as often and say, hey, I do have this project. It's currently broken due to the API limitations. Um, and it might even help you to leave a link to the API documentation as to how it is that it ran out of information. That way, any potential employer that's looking at your application, they can say, oh, well, he clearly understands APIs and how they work, which is not a common thing nowadays. All right. Any other questions? Perfect. If there aren't any other questions today, let's do a quick overview over everything we've created. So today we created an API app. Well, first we went into exploring our entire API documentation. We then created a playground where we were able to actually utilize OAuth to authenticate ourselves, create an endpoint where we could actually place in user input and send requests to this API to then print it into our terminal. We evolved this script and turned it into an actual view that's connected to our Pokédex project by creating an app called API app. We created this view here, which utilizes os.environ to hide our secret keys. This view then sends a request to the icon, or I think that's what it's called, the icon API. Let me see, the noun project API, I apologize, and returns a thumbnail URL. Once this view was created, we plugged it in through our URL parameters all the way back to the project. And inside of our project, we also went over to settings.py and added the API app into our installed apps. Once we ensured this was working successfully, we went over the process of how to handle secret keys. We grabbed this .env file to load the .env. This .env file holds environment variables, such as my API key, my secret key, and my Django key. I have this load.env function in the settings.py because it's the first script within my project to be executed after manage.py. The reason why I'm not having a dot slash for going back a directory when establishing a relative path is because everything is in relation to manage.py, which is the file being executed when I run my server. From there, I went ahead and applied the same logic of os.environ.getSecretKey to my API view to ensure that my secret keys were hidden within my code. And then finally, we ended the lesson by writing a test API file that was able to create a mock response and mock a client sending a request to our application to grab a preview URL. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we covered today? Fantastic. If no one has any questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording here.